There's an old garden a few streets from my house that still doesn't make sense to me. Every summer, the tomatoes stay dark green, the beans climb like crazy, and the soil never seems dry or exhausted. But the owner hardly uses fertilizer at all. Meanwhile, a lot of modern gardeners are doing the exact opposite. We feed constantly. Liquid fertilizer, granules, compost boosters, calcium sprays, and yet somehow the soil keeps getting weaker. Plants turn yellow faster, beds dry out quicker, and every season feels like starting over again. That's the part nobody talks about enough. Older gardens stayed productive long before chemical fertilizers became normal, not because those gardeners had better products, but because the soil itself was still alive. Underneath those gardens was a hidden ecosystem full of fungi, microbes, worms, and decaying organic matter quietly feeding plants day after day. And once that living system disappears, fertilizer starts acting more like a temporary life support machine than real fertility. The longer I've gardened, the more I've realized something uncomfortable. Modern gardeners may not have a fertilizer problem at all. We may have a dead soil problem. One of the most frustrating feelings in gardening is standing in front of a plant you've been feeding for weeks and watching it still struggle. A lot of people know exactly what that looks like. Tomato leaves slowly turning pale even after fertilizer. Raised beds drying out only a day or two after watering. Cucumbers collapsing in the middle of summer heat while the soil underneath feels hard and dusty like powder. So the natural reaction is to add more. More nitrogen, more compost, more liquid feed. Maybe a calcium spray because someone online said blossom end rot means deficiency. Maybe fish emulsion. Maybe seaweed extract. And for a few days, the plants respond. The leaves green up a little. Growth speeds up. It feels like the problem is solved. Then 2 weeks later, the same weakness comes back again. That cycle wears people down over time because it slowly turns gardening into maintenance instead of growth. The soil starts acting less like a living system and more like an empty container that constantly needs refilling. What's interesting is older gardens often didn't behave this way. Talk to people who grew up around older backyard gardens or small family farms, and you'll hear the same quiet observations repeated over and over. The soil stayed soft. It held moisture longer. Plants seemed steadier, not necessarily bigger, but healthier in a deeper way. And the gardeners themselves often disturbed the soil far less than we do today. That difference matters more than most people realize. Because once soil loses the living organisms that recycle nutrients naturally, fertilizer stops acting like support and starts acting like survival. The first time I really understood this, it wasn't because of a fertilizer test or some gardening book. It happened after digging into a neglected corner behind an old shed that nobody had touched in years. The strange thing was how alive the soil felt. About 2 inches below the surface, the dirt turned dark and cool even in the middle of summer. There were tiny white fungal threads running through the soil like spiderwebs. Worms everywhere. Bits of half-decayed leaves breaking apart slowly into something rich and earthy. The ground smelled almost sweet, the way a forest floor smells after rain. And yet nobody had fed that area in a very long time. That's when something started clicking for me. Healthy old gardens weren't surviving because they had more nutrients added to them. They survived because the soil had built an underground system that constantly recycled life back into itself. Leaves fell. Worms pulled them down. Fungi broke down tough organic matter. Bacteria released minerals slowly over time. Moisture stayed trapped deeper underground because organic matter acted almost like a sponge. Plant roots weren't sitting alone in dead dirt. They were connected to a living network that kept feeding them quietly every day. Most people never see this part because it happens underneath the surface. And modern gardening accidentally interrupts these systems constantly. We strip leaves away. We expose bare soil to direct sun. We till aggressively. We pour fast-release nutrients into the ground without rebuilding the organisms that naturally cycle those nutrients long-term. The result is a garden that may grow fast for short periods, but slowly loses its ability to sustain itself. That's why some soil can test fertile on paper and still grow weak plants. Because biologically, the soil is starving. What's fascinating is that many older gardeners understood this without ever using words like microbial ecology or soil biology. They learned it simply by paying attention year after year. My grandfather used to say you could tell the health of a garden by how the soil smelled in the morning. If it smelled sour, dusty, or lifeless, something underneath was out of balance. But if the soil smelled rich and earthy, he trusted the garden would usually take care of itself. A lot of older growers treated soil almost like a living animal instead of a product. They rarely left the ground exposed for long. Fallen leaves stayed where they landed. Kitchen scraps got buried slowly between rows. Grass clippings dried into mulch instead of getting hauled away in plastic bags. Nothing was wasted because they understood something modern gardening often forgets. Every piece of organic matter feeds something underground. And over time, that underground life becomes incredibly stable. Old gardens developed layers. Not just physical layers of compost and humus, but biological layers too. Worm tunnels carried oxygen and water deeper into the soil. Fungi stretched through the ground, connecting root systems together. Certain bacteria helped hold moisture during hot weather. Even weeds sometimes played a hidden role by pulling minerals upward from deeper soil levels. Most older gardeners probably couldn't explain the chemistry behind any of this, but they noticed the results. Soil stayed softer. Water lasted longer. Plants recovered faster after stress. Meanwhile today, many gardens are kept visually clean but biologically empty. Bare soil may look tidy for a while, but underground it behaves very differently. Direct sun bakes the surface. Moisture evaporates faster. Microbial colonies collapse. Organic matter burns away quicker than it can rebuild. And once that living layer disappears, gardeners often end up chasing problems season after season without realizing the real damage happened underground years earlier. The deeper you dig into how healthy soil actually works, the stranger it becomes. Because plants are not simply sitting in dirt absorbing nutrients the way most people imagine. Underneath every healthy garden is a constant biological exchange happening every second. Plant roots are actively feeding the soil. That surprises a lot of people the first time they hear it. But roots release sugars, amino acids, and carbon compounds into the ground on purpose. These substances are called root exudates, and they act almost like payment to underground microbes. In exchange, bacteria and fungi help deliver minerals and moisture back to the plant. It's not random. It's a living trade system. Some fungal networks can stretch surprisingly far through the soil, connecting multiple plants together underground. These fungi attach themselves directly to plant roots and dramatically increase the root system's ability to reach water and nutrients. In old forests, scientists have even found fungal networks transferring nutrients between trees. Healthy gardens work in a very similar way. But modern gardening practices often interrupt these relationships before they fully develop. Heavy tilling breaks apart fungal strands that may have taken months to establish. Constant synthetic feeding can make plants less dependent on microbial partnerships because nutrients become immediately available without biological exchange. And over time, the soil starts losing diversity. That's when gardens begin showing strange symptoms people constantly misdiagnose. Water runs off the surface instead of soaking in. Soil compacts faster. Plants become more sensitive to heat. Pests attack stressed plants more aggressively. Fertilizer gives short bursts of growth, but the overall system keeps weakening underneath. A lot of gardeners think they have a nutrient deficiency problem when they actually have a biological communication problem underground. And one of the biggest hidden losses is moisture retention. Living soil behaves differently during heat because organic matter, fungi, and microbial colonies help hold water deep below the surface. In dead soil, moisture disappears fast. The top layer turns crusty. Roots stay shallow because conditions deeper underground are unstable. That's why older gardens often survived summer stress better even without constant watering. The soil itself was functioning like a living sponge. Meanwhile, many modern beds are being treated almost like hydroponic systems in dirt form. Constant feeding, constant correction, constant intervention, but very little biological rebuilding. And eventually the soil becomes chemically supported, but biologically exhausted. That's the part most fertilizer companies never really talk about. One of the biggest turning points for me as a gardener was realizing I needed to stop asking, how do I feed this plant? And start asking, how do I feed the soil underneath it? Those are not the same thing. A lot of old gardening methods were quietly designed around rebuilding biological life, even if people didn't describe it that way back then. They kept the ground covered. They returned organic matter constantly. They disturbed the soil less than we do now. And little by little, the soil rebuilt its own fertility naturally. One of the simplest ways to start restoring that system is with layered organic matter. Not giant complicated compost systems. Just steady inputs that mimic what happens on a forest floor. Dry leaves, grass clippings, small amounts of kitchen scraps buried shallow between rows. A thin layer of unfinished compost around plants. Even shredded cardboard underneath mulch can help stabilize moisture while fungi slowly colonize the material. The goal is not instant feeding. The goal is creating an environment where bacteria, fungi, worms, and beneficial organisms can return and stay active consistently. One thing I started noticing after mulching heavily for a few seasons was how different the soil felt underneath. Even during hot afternoons, the ground stayed cool and slightly damp a few inches below the surface. Earthworms started appearing again where I hadn't seen them in years. Water stopped running off so quickly. Plants looked less stressed between watering cycles. That's usually the first sign living soil is recovering. And interestingly, the healthiest changes are often invisible at first. Root systems deepen quietly underground long before the top growth dramatically changes. Fungal colonies begin reconnecting broken soil structures. Organic matter slowly transforms into stable humus that can hold both nutrients and moisture for long periods. Some older gardeners also use diluted compost tea or soaked leaf water, not because it magically fertilized plants overnight, but because it reintroduced microbial life back into tired soil. The effect was subtle at first, but over time, gardens became noticeably more resilient. That word matters. Resilient. Because truly healthy soil doesn't just grow plants faster. It helps gardens recover from stress better in the first place. And this is where a lot of modern gardeners accidentally sabotage their own progress without realizing it. They improve the soil for a few weeks, then destroy the biological recovery before it fully stabilizes. One of the most common examples is constantly leaving soil bare between plants. Bare soil might look neat and controlled, but biologically it creates stress almost immediately. Sunlight bakes the surface. Moisture evaporates faster. Temperatures swing wildly between day and night. Many beneficial microbes simply cannot survive those conditions for long. Nature almost never leaves soil exposed for a reason. Even forests protect the ground with fallen leaves, decomposing branches, moss, and living roots. That protective layer is what allows microbial life to remain active continuously. Another mistake is overfeeding with fast-release fertilizer every time plants show weakness. The difficult part is that fertilizer often works temporarily, which makes the cycle harder to notice. Plants grow fast for a short period, but shallow growth is not always healthy growth. In fact, excessive nitrogen can sometimes create plants that look impressive above ground while roots remain weak underneath. Soft, fast growth also attracts more pest pressure because stressed plants produce different chemical signals insects can detect surprisingly well. Then there's excessive tilling. A lot of gardeners still think turning soil aggressively every season loosens it. But in living soil, structure is already being built naturally by fungi, roots, worms, and microbial activity. Heavy tilling can break apart those networks repeatedly before they mature. It's a little like rebuilding a town, then bulldozing the roads every few months. And perhaps the biggest hidden mistake is impatience. Living soil recovers slowly. Modern gardening culture often expects instant visible results, but biological restoration happens in layers. Sometimes the first improvement isn't greener leaves at all. Sometimes it's simply the soil holding moisture one extra day after watering. That small change matters more than most people realize. Because once soil begins retaining life again, fertility stops depending entirely on what comes out of a bag. When soil starts coming back to life, the changes don't usually show up the way people expect. It's not an instant explosion of growth. It's quieter than that, more subtle. The first thing I usually notice is water behavior. After a few seasons of rebuilding organic matter, the soil doesn't dry out in that sharp, stressful way anymore. It holds moisture deeper down, almost like it remembers how to store it. Then the texture starts changing. Instead of hard crust forming on the surface, the top layer stays slightly loose. Darker, easier to break apart with your fingers. And when you dig just a little, you start seeing those small signs again. Fine roots spreading more evenly, tiny white fungal threads returning, earthworms slowly rebuilding their tunnels. That's the point where you realize something important. The garden isn't being fed anymore in the way most people think. It's feeding itself again. One of the simplest recovery methods I've seen work over and over is what I'd call constant light return. Not heavy compost dumps or dramatic soil overhauls, but small, steady additions of organic material that mimic what happens naturally on a forest floor. A thin layer of shredded leaves. A bit of unfinished compost tucked around plants instead of mixed deeply. Grass clippings left to break down slowly under mulch. Even old plant stems chopped and left in place rather than removed completely. Nothing complicated, just continuity. And over time, that continuity is what rebuilds the biological memory of the soil. There's also something people underestimate: microbial reintroduction. Healthy compost isn't just nutrients, it's living colonies. When those microbes return to the soil, they begin rebuilding the communication system between roots and nutrients. Plants don't just take in fertilizer anymore. They start interacting with the soil again. This is where gardens begin to feel different emotionally too. Less reactive, less fragile. Plants stop swinging between overgrowth and collapse. Instead, they settle into a steadier rhythm, like they're finally growing in a system that supports them instead of constantly pushing them. And once you've seen that shift, it's hard to go back to thinking of soil as just dirt that needs feeding. Even after the soil starts improving, there's a stage most gardeners still get wrong. Because the biggest mistake at that point is thinking the job is done. But living soil doesn't work like a fixed repair. It behaves more like a relationship. It only stays healthy if the conditions that brought it back to life are maintained consistently. One of the most common setbacks happens when gardeners return to old habits too quickly. The soil looks better, so they scale back mulch. They reduce organic inputs. They go back to clean, bare beds because it looks tidy again. And slowly, the system starts slipping back into its old pattern. Another mistake is overcorrecting with fertilizer at the first sign of stress. A slightly pale leaf doesn't always mean deficiency. Sometimes it's just the soil adjusting its internal balance as microbial populations shift. But modern gardening conditioning makes people react immediately, adding nutrients that the system may not actually need in that moment. That's how dependency starts again. There's also a misunderstanding about weeds. In weakened soil, weeds are often treated as enemies. But in many older systems, weeds were seen more as indicators. Certain weeds actually show you what the soil is trying to correct: compaction, missing minerals, or poor drainage. Removing them without understanding why they appeared is like silencing a warning signal without fixing the cause. And perhaps the most overlooked mistake is disturbing recovering soil too often. Every time you dig deeply or reset a bed aggressively, you're not just moving dirt. You're resetting microbial progress that took weeks or months to establish. In a recovering system, stability matters more than perfection. The irony is that most gardeners don't fail because they don't care enough. They fail because they care too actively, too constantly, without letting the biology of the soil settle into its own rhythm again. And when you finally stop interrupting that process so much, something surprising begins to happen. When a garden starts to truly turn around, it rarely announces itself in a dramatic way. There's no sudden explosion of growth that happens overnight. Instead, the changes creep in quietly, almost like the soil is slowly exhaling after being held under stress for too long. You start noticing small things first. Watering doesn't feel like a race against time anymore. The soil stays damp a little longer after irrigation. That dry, crusty surface layer that used to form so quickly begins to soften and break apart more easily. Even after a hot week, when you scratch just below the surface, there's still a coolness there that wasn't present before. Then the plants begin to shift. Leaves stop reacting so violently to minor changes in weather. Instead of constantly yellowing or curling under stress, they start to hold their structure more steadily. Growth doesn't necessarily become explosive, but it becomes more consistent. Predictable in a way that feels almost unfamiliar if you've been fighting your soil for years. One of the most telling signs is how plants recover after stress. A heat wave passes, and instead of staying damaged for weeks, they bounce back faster. A period of overwatering or dryness doesn't leave the same long-lasting scars. It's like the entire system has gained a kind of memory again, a resilience that wasn't there before. Underground, something even more important is happening, even if you never see it directly. Worm activity increases. The soil begins to form more stable clumps instead of collapsing into dust. When you pull up a plant, the roots no longer look short and strained. They start spreading deeper, more confidently, exploring the soil instead of just surviving in it. And this is usually the moment experienced gardeners pause for a second, because they realize they're no longer constantly fixing the garden. They're just observing it. The soil has started to regulate itself again, slowly rebuilding the kind of balance that used to exist in older gardens long before synthetic inputs became the default solution. And once you've seen that shift with your own eyes, it changes the way you think about fertilizer forever. At this point in the process, most people assume the secret was just adding more organic matter or using less fertilizer. But there's one quieter detail that often decides whether a garden fully stabilizes or slowly slips back into dependence. It has nothing to do with what you add, and everything to do with what you stop interrupting. Healthy soil doesn't just rely on inputs. It relies on uninterrupted time. Every living system underground works on a rhythm that is slower than human intervention. Fungal networks don't rebuild in a week. Microbial colonies don't stabilize after a single compost application. Worm populations don't return just because conditions briefly improve. These systems need continuity to fully re-establish themselves. And that's where a lot of recovery attempts quietly fail. Gardeners improve the soil, see early signs of progress, and then assume it's safe to return to old patterns of digging, heavy feeding, or frequent disturbance. But in a regenerating system, each disruption resets part of the biological structure that hasn't fully anchored yet. One of the most overlooked hidden tricks older gardeners unintentionally used was consistency without interference. They didn't constantly rotate strategies or chase perfect soil conditions. Instead, they created stable environments and allowed natural processes to accumulate over time. Even something as simple as leaving mulch undisturbed for a full season has a compounding effect. Underneath that layer, fungi extend further. Moisture gradients stabilize. Microbes form more complex relationships. Each month builds on the last, rather than restarting from zero. There's also a subtle shift that happens when you stop overcorrecting plant behavior. When a leaf slightly yellows or growth slows, the instinct is to intervene immediately. But in a living system, small fluctuations are often part of rebalancing, not failure. If you constantly react to every minor signal, you interrupt the soil's ability to self-regulate. The real bonus insight, if there is one, is this. Healthy soil is not maintained by control, but by allowing processes to finish. And once you learn to recognize the difference between a system that is failing and a system that is simply reorganizing itself, your entire approach to gardening changes permanently. There's a moment in every long-term garden where things stop feeling like a project you're managing and start feeling like a place that's managing itself. You don't notice it all at once. It usually shows up in small, ordinary moments that don't feel important until you look back later. You water less often, but nothing collapses. You stop chasing deficiencies, but plants don't spiral the way they used to. You walk through the garden after a stretch of hot weather and expect damage, but instead you find everything quietly holding its shape. And maybe the most surprising part is how little effort it starts to take just to keep things stable. The soil doesn't feel like something you're constantly trying to fix anymore. It feels like something that has settled into its own rhythm again. Moisture stays where it should. Roots spread deeper without being pushed. Organic matter breaks down at a steady pace instead of disappearing too quickly. It's not perfection. Old gardens were never perfect, but they were balanced in a way that didn't demand constant correction. Standing there, you start to realize something that changes the whole perspective. The goal was never really more fertilizer or better products. Those were just tools used to compensate for a deeper loss. What was actually missing was time, biological continuity, and the kind of living soil structure that can only form when the ground is left to function as an ecosystem again. And once you see that clearly, it becomes hard to unsee. Because the real difference between old gardens and many modern ones isn't effort. It's whether the soil is still allowed to be alive enough to take care of the plants on its own. Sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do for a garden is to stop interrupting it long enough for it to remember what it already knows how to do.